You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone.
This is episode 514 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He is a staff writer over at RT. And everybody be sure to check out the article that me and Will just put out over at the Libertarian Institute. We cover the Russiagate saga, why it's, and we got really great feedback on it. So check out the show notes page or just the Libertarian Institute, to get our work in. Will, welcome back to the show. How you doing today?
Hey, thanks for having me, Kyle. I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's been a good week. It's a nice week when we publish an article. You feel a little bit more accomplished, and especially this one. We put a lot of hard work into it, and it came out great. So, we'll be talking a little bit about Russia on the show today. But first, let's start off talking about Joe Biden, the DNC presidential candidate still, I suppose. It always, I guess, right now surprises me that is the case. Just somebody who has spent so much time in his basement over the past, 3 months is now leading in the polls to be next president. Now, I guess Biden's platform, it seems to me that the best way it could be described is pretty much anti-Trump. Like, he has like the generic Democratic policies, I suppose, but most of the way he focuses on it is that I'm not Donald Trump. And so, Will, this could go one of two ways. If he looks at Donald Trump's policy for Russia and reads our article and realizes that Donald Trump has been a total Russia hawk, and he takes the opposite, policy as that, well, that's great. Although, we got to remember that we're talking about Washington, D.C. And so no matter how hawkish somebody is, the opposite position is always being more hawkish. So that's kind of where we stand. And it comes across here cartoonishly in this tweet he has about Venezuela. I'll remind you, there's been a few of these in the past month that I mentioned on the show. But on this one, he talks about, on this Venezuelan Independence Day, my thoughts and prayers are with the Venezuelans who continue tirelessly for the cause of democracy. It's time for fair elections so that the Venezuelan people can turn on the corrupt and repressive Maduro regime. So, the first thing that kind of comes to mind here is that, he just assumes that the Venezuelan elections, that the democracy there, or that the, vote there in the democracy doesn't represent the will of the people. But it does seem to me to be the case that whenever they hold elections, the election monitors come in and Maduro wins. That doesn't mean that democracy is, the great God and that, socialism is somehow preferable system or anything like that. But, just dealing with the fact that that guy wins elections. I also find, the hypocrisy of it that Joe Biden asserts that, Donald Trump only won the election because of, Vladimir Putin. And so if he's, saying that a country has unfair elections, other countries should get involved in their internal affairs. Well, look at home first. And, this, of course, builds on his other tweets that he's had in the past saying that Donald Trump isn't supportive enough of the Venezuelan opposition, Juan Guaido, except that he's waged this maximum pressure campaign against the Venezuelan people. So, Will, I'm just wondering, we're still months away from the election now, and it's been kind of hard to comment on the election, in part because Donald Trump is just saying whatever and seems to be pretty much just reactionarily dealing with either COVID or, the protests and the statue toppling and whatever. And then, Biden's not publicly saying much of anything at all. I have a strong doubt, Will, and maybe I'm wrong, that Joe Biden actually drafted this tweet himself. This is probably somebody on his foreign policy team. I would be a little bit surprised if Joe Biden knows his own Twitter password. So, for that reason, it hasn't been super easy to talk about the election just because, maybe this time in 2016, Donald Trump is mentioning that Hillary Clinton has been a Syria hawk, and Hillary Clinton's talking about setting up a no-fly zone in Syria. That's just straight up not happening. But, this is, I guess, a little nugget of information that we're getting, about this upcoming campaign season where Joe Biden is taking the opposition position to Donald Trump, who's been a complete hawk, but he's going to be a bigger hawk. So I'll let you weigh in on any of that.
Yeah, it has been a weird race, of course, with the pandemic, with there's no real campaign events. Like Trump has had a couple rallies recently, but he was on hiatus for a while. So yeah, it is odd. You just get these occasional pronouncements from Twitter. And I agree, probably Biden didn't write this tweet. It's a little bit too coherent, I think. It's two complete sentences, so might not have been his doing. But nonetheless, it is interesting. Like you said, it is sort of when Biden's trying to position himself against Trump as the opposite of Trump, somehow he takes being an extra, he thinks that the answer to that is to be extra hawkish on Venezuela. Even though really I would think that the opposite of Trump's position on this would be to be a bit more of a dove, maybe. To, maybe call out some of the sanctions and how they're affecting, the people of Venezuela. There's all kinds of positions Biden could stake out on that sort of more, more dovish end. But it seems clear he's pursuing this, he's trying to out-hawk Trump on this question. And we have seen other tweets from Biden that are kind of similar to this, where he's staking out this more right-wing position. He's trying to go from Trump's right, which is odd. You'd think that he would be trying to do the opposite. But I don't know. Part of this kind of says to me that Biden's trying to hold on to some of the Democratic establishment, obviously, that would be more interested in this more hawkish policy. Because right now, he obviously has to cater to some degree to the more progressive elements of the party that are really ascendant right now, with the Squad and AOC and that whole kind of newer generation of more progressive Democrats. He has to try to, pander to them a little bit, but this move is definitely not going to do that, I don't think. I think this move is designed more to go to the more establishment elements of the Democratic Party, because certainly I think that more AOC, Bernie wing of the party would not be into this kind of hawkish rhetoric on Venezuela and talking about the murderous Maduro regime and all this stuff. So it definitely does seem like he's trying to reach out to that more establishment centrist faction of the Democrats.
Right. And I think we'll get a lot more insight into this when Biden pits his VP. A top name on the list, as far as I understand it, is Susan Rice, and, a disgraced Libya fame. And, that's maybe a name that I have to start talking about on the podcast a little bit more here. But, she's going full Russia conspiracy theory and, seems to be in the running. So, that's on the radar. A conversation that I think is going to be one that continues throughout the summer here, Will, is the potential annexation of large portions of the West Bank. Reportedly, this could have happened as early as July 1st, but, obviously that date has come and gone, and annexation has not happened. So can you give us an update a little bit on what the status here is? Is it going to maybe come as a surprise, or do you have any idea what's going on?
Yeah. So the Israelis have lately been signaling more and more that they're going to move ahead on something they've been threatening to do for quite a long time. This is not a new proposal of annexing some big chunk of the West Bank to take it and make it their own territory. Obviously, the West Bank is occupied by Israeli forces right now, but this would mean making it as part of what we call Israel proper. Actually making it part of their territory. Now, in terms of the plan, I don't think they've actually given a ton of detail about what they intend to do or exactly what they plan on taking. But there are a couple more likely scenarios, I think, that have been raised that we can kind of go over here. So I know Netanyahu himself has threatened a couple times to take the Jordan Valley area specifically. And that area has strategic value. It's right along the border there with Jordan on the West Bank and the eastern side of the West Bank. It's got a lot of fertile land, and it has it has strategic value. I think I said that. It has a decent Palestinian population, too, of 60 or 65,000. And so this seems to be one of the more common suggestions that they're going to take this area. And so that would mean, putting, tens of thousands of Palestinians under Israeli rule if they took that valley. But there's also been more talk that they're going to take areas a greater area of Area C, a greater portion of Area C, which contains the Jordan Valley. And for those who might not know, the West Bank is divided up into these 3 administrative regions. It was done so under the Second Oslo Accord, and that was an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians in 1995, and it created these areas A, B, and C. And Area C is by far the largest of the 3, and it's 60% of the West Bank, I think. And under the Oslo Agreement, Israel maintains like total control over that zone. They control the security of all three areas of like pretty much the whole West Bank, but they exercise, I think, even like civil authority over Area C as well. And that kind of leaves the Palestinian Authority with only like a small sliver of territory to actually govern. And under that Oslo Agreement, the Israelis were supposed to gradually return Area C to Palestinian control. But in the 25 years since they've signed that deal, they have not given back any of it. And so this area is sort of de facto annexed already, like it's covered in military outposts and Israel kind of controls it already. And so this is one of the more likely areas that they'd be looking to annex, at least some part of it, of Area C there. And so that would include the Jordan Valley and maybe even some areas outside of it. And Area C is also where all like the majority of the Israeli settlements are located. And so like, again, that's where this land grab would really be focused if they're going to take a chunk of the West Bank. I don't think they can get away with taking the entire portion of Area C. That's over half of the West Bank. But I think they would at least go for like these major settlement blocks where, a lot of, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israelis live. Regardless, though, of like what they're actually looking to take specifically of like what areas they're gonna grab. The number I've heard thrown around a lot is that it's 1/3 of the West Bank they're going to try to take. That's what they're looking to annex. And, the settlements there have been this massive issue throughout the conflict. They complicate any hope for a Palestinian statehood or independence or a peace deal. There's all this infrastructure that's been built in the West Bank, like this big network of highways that kind of divides up the whole West Bank. And it kind of really makes it hard to ever establish a Palestinian state. Like especially if Israel were to annex these areas, because then you'd have to build a Palestinian state around this Israeli territory, and it would kind of be broken up into a bunch of little Bantustan kind of things. And so that is one of the major complicating issues right now with in the conflict. And it's sort of one of the major things that would be happening with this annexation. It would kind of move that ball forward. But more recently,
can I just ask? Yeah, I just want to clarify here. Do we have any idea of what the status of the Palestinians would be? You talk about the Bantustans. I think some people would call the map saying that it looks like Swiss cheese, where there's these little holes and carve outs of, Palestinian, I guess that would be administered like city areas that are possibly loosely connected by like roads and tunnels to the other Palestinian administrative areas. So do we know if those like people would have their own security forces? Would they have police or military? And then also, would they get to vote in Israeli elections, seeing how anything that Israel does is going to impact them? If they're essentially only way to connect with another, little locality or city is, by going through a tunnel or a road that's essentially a part of Israel.
Yeah, as far as I understand this, under this annexation, like, again, they haven't given out, tons of detail about this. But as far as I understand, the Palestinians who'd be caught up in this would not be given citizenship. So I don't think they would be allowed to vote in Israeli elections. What I have heard is that they would be in these little enclave areas that would have some like semblance of independence, some, element of like local control. But, ultimately they would be under the thumb of Israeli authority, of civil and military authority. So they wouldn't actually have any real independence. They'd be in these little like semi sort of autonomous enclaves, but again, under the thumb of the Israeli military and, civil authority. But yeah, no voting rights as far as I understand for those Palestinians.
Right. Well, it must be a terrifying position that to be there for the people of the West Bank who I guess, because they have enjoyed a somewhat better living standard than the people of Gaza, for the past 10 or 15 years. But, if they're locked in these little areas, it seems like it could very quickly be worse than Gaza, where, they're essentially just trapped in little small open air prisons. And, it'll be interesting to see a couple of things. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. I appreciate hearing, but you go on with your analysis too. It's just how the U.S. politics is going to react. I have been seeing this week, there's apparently a letter that's been signed by the Squad and Bernie, who don't always agree with what they have to say, but basically saying that they want to condition Israel's foreign aid that they get like $3.8 billion a year on human rights violations. Now, obviously, this isn't going to go far enough, and it's going to be far short of, what any reasonable, kind of arbitrator would decide, much less what me or you think are what the Palestinians actually deserve. But this does seem to be a step towards somebody standing up to Israel on this, and so I guess that, and then also how Israel is going to sell this in the larger global community, that this isn't just an apartheid state at this point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in terms of like the U.S. position on this, like, I think some of this will depend on the election. It also depends on how soon Israel plans to go ahead with this. Because what I was going to say next is that sort of this annexation plan, like in the last week or so, it's actually kind of stalled out a bit. Like you had mentioned, Netanyahu had originally announced this for July 1st. They said that they could start, carrying out this action as early as that. But that's come and gone without any action. And I don't think they've announced any new date. I think they said they're going to pick another new date, but haven't actually done so yet. And as part of that stalling out, a lot of the reporting is mentioning how the Israelis are currently in talks with the U.S. right now. And so part of this stalling might have to do with sort of the U.S. position in the U.S. talks. I know that in Trump's own peace plan and his whole deal of the century thing for the Israelis and Palestinians, it calls for some annexation of the West Bank. It calls for some territory transfer. But it also is supposed to create this like disarmed rump state for the Palestinians. So made up of a bunch of little broken pieces of territory. However, Netanyahu is not even offering that concession to them. He's just insisting that Palestinian statehood has nothing to do with this annexation. However, though, I do wonder if the Trump administration has obviously been very much on Israel's side, as the U.S. almost always is. We give them billions of dollars in aid every year. We don't condition that on any kind of behavior, to behave toward the Palestinians. And Trump in particular has been very much a backer of Netanyahu in the state of Israel. But nonetheless, I do wonder if maybe he's trying to, kind of saying, hey, man, chill out with this annexation. It's kind of screwing up my whole major, peace deal here, my deal of the century. So I do wonder if sort of the U.S. end, the U.S. position on this is sort of stalling it out. And I have also seen, like you said, I saw the progressive Democrats coming out against this. I've seen some European states sort of posturing against this. They're traditionally much more, skeptical of the Israeli annexation project and the whole occupation project than the Americans are. So I have seen some international, backlash to this, including from some politicians in the U.S. But I think it's even interesting that the Trump administration might even be putting up some resistance to this. They have, I think, given some signals that they would approve of this, but I don't think they've given any kind of formal rubber stamp for the annexation. And so I wonder if they're still trying to work out some of those details and make sure it won't conflict too much with Trump's, peace plan. So I think that's kind of where things are at with this right now. It's the plan of annexation is sort of in limbo. I've heard some Israeli officials coming out and saying that maybe this won't happen as soon as they had previously claimed. But with the way things are right now, it does seem like it could just happen any day here. They could come out and announce that this is going to start, within the next week. So it is sort of unclear of what will happen next with this.
Just real quick. So Israel politically, do you think it would just happen, or would it have to move through the Knesset maybe a regular piece of legislation, where I think they have something that looks a little bit more like the Canadian style, where they do 3 readings of the bill and it has to pass 3 votes?
I'm not totally sure, actually, in terms of what legislation they've passed in this. The stuff I had seen, it seemed like they were doing this more unilaterally, it would be a military operation or something. But I'm not actually sure in terms of what legislation. I know that this does have some backing from Benny Gantz, that Netanyahu's main rival in the elections, who he's now kind of reconciled with, and they have some kind of steady alliance going, or shaky alliance. I mean, I know that he's also sort of not put up too much resistance to this. But yeah, I'm not sure. I know there's obviously some segments of Israeli society who would be opposed to this. I was even reading an article recently about some settlers who are not too happy about this idea, who are worried about what this might mean. But yeah, I'm not totally sure about what legislation they've put forward, or what they would have to put forward under their system there.
Right. Well, do you have anything else on annexation? I mean, I guess a lot of people feel like there is something of a maybe November deadline, although I don't see why it would be particularly November. I imagine that I could go through January. I wouldn't see why a lame duck Trump would do anything to stop Israeli annexation, or who can necessarily stop him if he just kind of tells Netanyahu to do what he wants. So do you see any thing coming up in a particular time frame, or again, it could be nothing. And then I guess the other thing I did see a couple people note that I thought was worth mentioning is it may seem like, I guess, or maybe portrayed here in the media that if Israel decides not to go through with annexation, or maybe a very, very small, like just little, take a couple of the major settlements and really, in a lot of ways, maybe not take enough to actually, like bisect the West Bank and really kill the two-state solution in the minds of anybody who could even look at a map. You know what I mean? That's the stats we're at. So maybe he takes some things that don't, equate exactly to being obvious on the map that there's no two-state solution. And then pretending that's some kind of victory and some kind of concession to Israel, to the Palestinians, and then, be mad when the Palestinians say that's not enough, or see, kind of what the Western media always does, where they portray Israel as being good faith negotiators, having no partners on the other side, and then just, throwing their hands up and, well, what can we do? So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you hit on a lot of the stuff is up in the air right now. Like they, again, haven't really declared their intent, like of exactly what they plan on taking or when they're going to do this. So I think some of this is sort of in limbo. And I think you did lay out some of the potential there that, like, they may go through with this, but they might sort of scale it back to where it wouldn't be a total, like, catastrophic thing to the future of, any potential peace deal with the Palestinians. I think that's also possible. That could be on the table. It's certainly possible that they don't do anything at all. Like, I know that they've threatened certainly to take parts of the West Bank before. This would not be the first time they've mentioned that. It did seem this time that they were a little more serious about it. It seemed like they were really gearing up to do it. But, who knows? Maybe that was a bluff and they're doing that for some political reason. Like, I think a lot of this is sort of in limbo right now. We kind of just have to wait and see what will happen. It does seem more likely that it seems like they would try this under Trump. They would rather have Trump in office to do this rather than potentially Biden, who, he might be fairly accommodating to this move, but I don't know. I tend to think Trump would be a little more, I think they would prefer to have him in office when they did this. So I guess that would set up some kind of deadline. But again, a lot of this stuff is sort of just unclear.
So I want to move on to the Russian bounty hoax now, because I really think that is probably one of the more important things that me and you could be talking about coming up and going over the evidence that's coming out, explaining why it's incorrect. Because I think it really impacts two huge foreign policy issues. One is ending America's longest war in Afghanistan, and the other one is a part of the narrative that we cover in our article, which is basically this just like festering DC idea that there's this evil Russian aggression and this rampant Russophobia among especially the American left that is just allowing for this McCarthyite atmosphere of blaming the Russians for literally anything, from the George Floyd rioting to the Taliban wanting to kill Americans, as absurd as either of those claims are. And it just be parroted and repeated as, one of the great early Russiagate reporters, Bob Perry said, as flat fat. That they just repeat this as the truth, even though in every article written about this, all the stories we always had those qualifying words: if confirmed, if true, anonymous source made this claim, but no actual solid, this is the evidence. So, tell us, I think we talked about this last week on the show. I've certainly talked about it quite a bit. I talked to John D'Angelo about this last week on the show. He had actually spent some time in Afghanistan, and he kind of said that this is absurd too. So, Will, what else do you have for us?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit more has come out on this story. It was not just a one-off thing. Like we had several write-ups. We had, I think it originated in the New York Times, but we've since had write-ups in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Some of the major newspapers in the country seemingly getting these intelligence leaks from these anonymous officials. And so we went over that a lot last week, sort of looking at like the flimsy sourcing on this story and just how, a lot of the weasel wording. Now, they didn't really prove anything they claimed to prove. In fact, they're really not even in that original story. They're really not even claiming the thing about the bounties. They're just saying that this was said, that this is a rumor, this was contained in an intelligence report. So like that's really what they're claiming. And it's, sort of several layers removed from the actual original source, which is supposed to be these, Taliban or Afghan criminals or militants. It was all kind of left deliberately vague, it seems. However, a little more has come out in the last week on this that we can maybe go over. There was a story in Business Insider last week that I think is like, if we're going to steel man their case, if we're going to give the strongest argument for the other side, I think this Business Insider story does that. Because this one, they actually had 3 Taliban fighters saying that the Russians do indeed pay these bounties for U.S. troops. So that's a little better, I guess, than having, like actually talking to the Taliban militants is a little better than just getting it through like 3 layers of anonymous sources that say this came somewhere from an intelligence report. And so that's a little more credible. However, the Business Insider story, these Taliban fighters are still anonymous. Like, we still don't get their names. They're low level, probably, to where getting their names wouldn't even really tell us much anyway. So like, these are fairly low level guys. The Taliban itself still denies this story and did so on record for the Business Insider piece. But yeah, you have these 3 unnamed Taliban fighters saying that yes, indeed, this happens. Now, another problem with this is that they don't give any quotes. Like, we don't actually know what these Taliban fighters said. The Business Insider just sort of like uncritically passes along that like, oh yeah, they say this happens. But I think it would give us a lot of detail, like interesting and useful detail, to know what they actually said. Did they say that like, oh yeah, I witnessed this, I watched a GRU guy give money to a Taliban fighter? Or is this a rumor that they've heard that they're sort of relaying? Like, how do they know this? But we don't get anything like that from Business Insider. They just, again, sort of pass this off uncritically and say that, oh yeah, they back up the story. So even I think that one of the best write-ups on this thing so far is very lacking and sort of not, it still sort of turtles all the way down, all anonymous sources. Like, we don't have, much good indication to really believe this. There's a lot of other problems too with this overall story that we can point out. Like, they never even say where this originated. They never say which intelligence agency originally gave us this. That remains totally vague. There's all kinds of like vague hedging language in every single write-up about this, which is sort of written like if true kind of like wording. So it's not telling you that this is confirmed. They're saying that this could be the case, and sort of like they're very wishy-washy about it. Last week, we also have the NSA coming out and sort of contradicting this claim in the Wall Street Journal. The Journal doesn't explain like what counter evidence they might have or why they disagree with it. But I think the fact that the NSA even felt the need to come out and make this known, that they're sort of dissenting about this, that I think says something alone. The Pentagon, too, has cast some doubt on this, saying that like they haven't seen any corroborating evidence for this, when you would think the Pentagon's interest would be to play something like this up, or at the very least just like remain silent about it, like don't give comments about it, let people think that it's happening. But no, instead we have the Pentagon and some of these intelligence agencies coming out and saying like, we haven't seen any good corroborating, information for this. There's also the question.
Can I just expand on something that was to me eye-opening and very kind of just illustrative of how much evidence there is here. Scott Ritter points out in his article that on this at Consortium News, and I'll link to this one on the show notes page. It's a definite read on this, as well as Scott Horton's article on it, which I'll also stick on the show notes page, which is also up at Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. But in the Ritter article, he points out that 2 of the agencies, and I believe one was CIA and one was either ODNI or the Pentagon Defense Intelligence Agency, only concluded moderate confidence. And Ritter explains that moderate confidence is saying that, hey, the facts like circumstantially align with what you're saying. But that doesn't mean that that's like the only conclusion that those facts could lead to. Is, what I mean? Let's say that, found the gun that the murder was committed in the same room as you, and everybody says, aha, you're the murderer. Well, there's 50 other people in the room. Then it gets a little bit more complicated. And so that's, kind of the amount of confidence that 2 of the agencies had. And then the NSA only, I guess, looked at low confidence, which is basically saying that, the facts that you put forward do not directly contradict the claim that you're trying to make, which is essentially nothing. So I thought that was pretty, illustrative of what the government case is here and how much information they really come forward with as far as did Russia do this.
Right. And this would not be by far not the first time that there's been some like piece of unverified intelligence, because like these intelligence agencies collect all kinds of information, and the whole idea is they get all this raw intelligence, and then they have analysts then go over it and sort of vet it and figure out, is this true? And they end up throwing out a lot of stuff and deciding that this is not credible. I mean, that is sort of how like the Pentagon Office of Special Plans helped to justify the Iraq War. They dug through the CIA's dumpster for all this unvetted intelligence and pieced together these nonsense narratives. And so you can do a lot with this sort of unvetted, unverified intelligence. And it sounds like that's sort of what happened here with this most recent Russian bounty story. There's also the question of why they would leak this now, when supposedly all this stuff happened months and months ago. Why are we just hearing about this now? Like any intelligence leak that you see like this is always motivated. There's always some reason that they put this information out there. And so who knows what that might be in this case, whether it's Trump's troop drawdown in Germany, or maybe it's the withdrawal from Afghanistan itself. But like oftentimes these things are done with certain policies in mind that they're trying to sort of like put obstacles in front of. So that is also a reason to always be suspicious, I think, of these kind of intelligence leaks. And yeah, like you said, Scott Horton's column on this is very much worth reading. I'm like, a lot of these points I'm summarizing are just like, I'm just summarizing things out of his column. So definitely go and read that. Another thing he mentions in there, though, too, is like this is not the first time that similar claims have been made about like ties between the Taliban and Russia. And so earlier on in Trump's presidency, I think back in 2017, you had a bunch of similar claims coming out then, too. And CNN in one of these stories tried to claim that Russia was arming the Taliban based on like photos and a few photos and videos they had. But it turns out that was complete nonsense. Task and Purpose, this like military news site run by veterans and stuff, they came out and showed that like they just completely debunked the story. They talked to all these weapons experts, and it turns out CNN didn't even come close to proving what they were claiming. They're just making like wild, outrageous claims on the basis of like a couple photos. And so like, these kind of claims have percolated in the press before and have been like, soundly debunked. And so you shouldn't, I don't know, when you see this kind of stuff, you shouldn't just think, oh, where there's smoke, there must be fire, because I'm seeing a claim. Like these claims oftentimes do make it into the mainstream press, and they're not always true. Oftentimes not. I think there were other broader claims too about like Taliban Russia ties that the Pentagon also kind of threw some cold water on, saying like we haven't really seen much of that. This stuff has been used though to try to tar Trump and tar his policy in Afghanistan. But like a lot of the reaction to this story, the Russian bounties thing, is just completely stupid. It makes no sense. Like if Russia were indeed doing this, if they were paying these bounties to kill U.S. soldiers, like wouldn't the idea then be to provoke the U.S. into staying in Afghanistan longer, to keep fighting these Taliban guys who keep killing our soldiers or something? Like wouldn't that be to stymie the withdrawal if it were true? And so like it's odd that the reaction then is to criticize Trump's drawdown in Afghanistan, his withdrawal, as if that is what would be beneficial to the Russians. Like if anything, they would want us to stay. And so like none of this makes any sense. Like the reaction to this is just outrageous. And it seems clear that it's more meant for domestic consumption. This is meant to hurt Trump and hem him in further using another Russia story.
Right. Well, and they've certainly picked up on the Russia line at every left-wing outlet. Joe Biden is talking about this. Susan Rice is talking about this. It's, this is on, I think, a concerning issue. And I think it's something that very much like Russiagate, the risk is that it just gets repeated and repeated and repeated until it becomes a part of the narrative. And everybody knows that Russia paid the Taliban to kill Americans, just like they overthrew the election in 2016. And if they keep piling all these different things up, Russia, stole Ukraine and, is doing all these nefarious things, then, the American people are going to become more and more hawkish against Russia. And unfortunately, as I talked about before, that, the opposite of being a hawk is being a greater hawk. And that certainly seems to be the position that Joe Biden is taking. So, let's maybe move on from looking at this from just Afghanistan a little bit and looking at it towards Russia. And, they're talking about, in the Congress, like not allowing U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which would be terrible, but also trying to hem Trump in from withdrawing U.S. troops from Germany, which, turns out he might be saying them to Poland. So maybe that's not such a bad idea. But the spirit of that legislation is certainly negative. And, so you have that and just, talking about more sanctions with Russia. So, is this just going to enter us into a little bit of a faster spiral in our downward relationship with Russia?
I mean, yeah, it certainly is just another step on that path. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. And that's how it's been done, too, is with these kind of like hysterical news stories like this, where, it becomes the talk of the town that, oh, my God, Trump, he didn't retaliate to the Russian menace when they're paying these Taliban fighters to kill American soldiers. And so, they create some big hysteria, and it advances the ball down the field a little bit more. And so, yeah, I do think it is just sort of another step in that direction. And yeah, you're right. They have started to do these. There's now legislative efforts to not only stymie his pullout of in Germany, which, as you said, might not really be that ideal if they're moving them to Poland anyway. But they're also trying to stymie his withdrawal from Afghanistan, too, and like painting every single move that he does here, any attempt at a drawdown as somehow in a move sure to please Vladimir Putin. Like, that's how everything is always framed. And that is literally, I forget what story it was. It might have been the original Afghanistan drawdown or the Syria drawdown. But that is literally how the mainstream press framed one of those stories. It was like that was how they said, in a move sure to please Putin. And so that's just become like sort of the archetype. That's just, when they can push stories like that, they can really advance this narrative and advance the, further destruction of U.S.-Russia relations.
Well, it's almost like you're saying that even if Russia were to say, give the U.S. aid in the middle of a pandemic, people on the left would suggest it's some kind of nefarious plot by the Kremlin to overthrow the country because Donald Trump is a puppet of Vladimir Putin. But good thing things haven't gotten to that level of crazy and hysteria yet, and it's worth having a conversation with everyone still. So we'll just live in that reality. Another real non-reality we live with is this situation in Hong Kong where you have hundreds, if not at least 1,000 now, high, iPhone, like smartphone recorded, great high definition video of cops beating Americans on the street of this country, clearly innocent and peaceful people, including, young white girls, just pointing out that I think these are, the people that if anybody sees somebody hit a young white girl, they're like, that person deserves to get their ass kicked. The cops are doing this with impunity on our streets, Will. But the big concern that, everybody, right, left, center, Joe Biden, everybody is talking about is just how terrible the situation is in Hong Kong and how the, U.S. has to put sanctions on China and all that. So how bad is it in Hong Kong? And, does the U.S. need to put all these sanctions and crack down on China because of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, as your listeners might recall, there's been sort of protests in Hong Kong since last year. I think last June they broke out over this extradition bill, where the Hong Kong legislature was trying to pass a bill that would make it easier for the Chinese to, extradite criminal suspects to the mainland. And I think that was all sparked off by this murder where this guy had killed his girlfriend and went and hid in Taiwan, I think, in one of the other sort of dissenting Chinese areas. Taiwan obviously considers itself its own territory. But the Chinese considered it part of their own, a province of China. And so that kicked off like months and months of these intense protests. Eventually that extradition bill was tabled and sort of, permanently withdrawn, and they're not going to do it anymore. However, we've now seen another spike of protests with this national security law that China is looking at passing, or maybe did pass already. But this new national security law would allow them to crack down on what they call sedition. And it does seem fairly draconian, honestly, like some of the provisions of this bill. If it were being passed in the U.S., I would certainly be alarmed by it. So, I don't have any different view about it when it's passed in Hong Kong or in China. But it has sparked off this whole new bout of protests, maybe not as intense as the one previously. But we're seeing it again. And this is also, we should note that Hong Kong has had bouts of protests for a while. 2014 saw also pretty big, mass demonstrations against the mainland there. But we have talked a little bit on this show about how the U.S. government has ways of indirectly backing these protest movements and revolutions in other countries. We've definitely gone over how the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED, how they played this big role in the coup in Ukraine back in 2014. And I think we've also previously mentioned the NED's operations in Hong Kong. They've spent quite a bit of money there. But there was this other recent story in Time magazine that gets into sort of another similar cutout organization in Hong Kong that's been backing the protest movement there that I felt was pretty interesting. And so back in June, there was a big shakeup at this agency, this org called the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is a government body. And for most of its existence was known as the Broadcasting Board of Governors. People might be more familiar with that name. But this is the agency that runs Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia and all these other American state media outlets, basically. And some of those were set up, during the Cold War to send anti-Soviet messages into the USSR. And so that's kind of been their purpose all along, some of these state media outlets, using media to sort of undermine regimes the U.S. doesn't like. And I guess to the extent that like Voice of America reported on like genuine Soviet crimes or whatever, like I'm not really opposed to them doing that. However, this body that oversees them, the Agency for Global Media, does take a more like active role in these foreign countries beyond just media that I think is interesting. And so while we're seeing all this like, hysteria and talk about Hong Kong, it is interesting to see what these American agencies are doing with U.S. tax dollars in Hong Kong, in these places. So this new guy was just appointed to lead that organization, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, a guy named Michael Pack. And right away, Michael Pack fired the heads of 4 of these news organizations, U.S. state media outlets, and he started slashing programs and kind of like clearing house in this agency, kind of doing like a big overhaul. And as part of that, he gave this blanket order to halt any new contracts or contract extensions to sort of figure out what direction they want to go with the agency with this new guy in charge. But in doing so, they ended up freezing $2 million in funds that were bound for the Hong Kong protest movement, which is, we're talking about a territory that's like has a population smaller than New York. So it's not like a huge country here. And so, $2 million is quite a bit of money to be flowing into Hong Kong there. And that money was supposed to be handed to another cutout organization to create like another layer of plausible deniability, the Open Technology Fund, which is another one of these agencies that pretends to be sort of an independent NGO, but it ends up being funded by the U.S. Congress and is overseen by the government. And so this agency was going to be spent to help activists and app developers and stuff in Hong Kong evade government surveillance there. At least that's what the sources on this Time story claim. That's what this money was going to be spent for. And in terms of the sourcing on this Time story, they do first cite these 2 anonymous people with knowledge of the matter sort of thing, which I would usually be very skeptical about, just nameless officials who are just supposed to be familiar with the matter. But later you do get an on-record confirmation from the agency itself. And so the government is not disputing this $2 million. These 2 sources did seem like they were trying to like damage the administration with this leak, sort of implying that this funding freeze is bad and that we should be sponsoring these protests in Hong Kong. But I think it was sort of like an interesting revelation about, American meddling overseas. It's almost like they didn't even realize they were making that admission in this story. And so I did just find that interesting that they were, the U.S. this agency that oversees American state media outlets is actively, intervening in the Hong Kong protests, that they were going to pour $2 million into these activists for, to help them evade surveillance and stuff. And it's not that I'm opposed to them evading Chinese government surveillance or the Hong Kong government surveillance, but I would just ask you to imagine what would the reaction be here if it were found that the Chinese government were bankrolling the Black Lives Matter movement or the Occupy Wall Street movement or some other similar protest in the U.S. Like, I just would ask you to imagine what would happen. Like, I think there would be hysteria, not only from the media, but from the government. And there'd be this huge push to retaliate with, sanctions or probably worse against China. And so I just find that to be an interesting sort of, double standard. When Washington does this, when we go and pour money into these foreign protest movements, it's just normal. You're not even supposed to question it if you even know about it.
I mean, I think there's a very clear analogy here that the left has been insanely outraged and tried to remove Donald Trump from office for what they could prove to be $46,000 in ads. And most of them not even talking about the election. So you're talking about multiple times more with 2 million. And that's in, again, a small population, like kind of city state autonomous area where you have the entire country that 46,000 was for. So I don't know. I just thought that was like a good comparison as to, how absurd the American double standard is here.
Yeah, right. When Russia allegedly spends less than 50 grand on ridiculous nonsense Facebook ads that don't even run before the election, that have nothing. It's like a total freak out. Like, oh my God, Russia's taken over our democracy. But yet we're just supposed to routinely pour millions of dollars into these activist movements overseas, and we're just supporting democracy, and that's all just fine. And so, like, I don't know, like, even if we're totally opposed to the Chinese government and its stance towards Hong Kong, which I pretty much am, like, if you look through that national security bill they passed, like, yeah, if I were I would probably be protesting against that too. But even if we feel that way, though, I still think we can be skeptical about our own government trying to hijack and commandeer those protest movements and these revolutions overseas. I mean, we've seen some fallout of these actions before. I mean, whether it's the unrest that was kicked off in Ukraine after Obama's coup there in 2014, or in Syria, where there's been an absolute bloodbath. I mean, remember, like what started there as a protest movement, as just a normal like pro-democracy movement, eventually grew into an armed opposition that became, very violent and became full of extremists, and it became a bloodbath over there. And that was all done with American backing and money and arms and training and all kinds of stuff. And so when we look at Hong Kong, yes, it might seem a little more benign there. We're just sort of backing these mass protests. It's not quite an armed opposition movement. But still, though, they never do this stuff for benevolent reasons. Like, I think you can always be suspicious when you see our government bankrolling protests. They're always up to no good with this. It's never for democracy or human rights or anything like that. It's always to expand American power and hegemony overseas. And so that is sort of, I think, like the proper take on these protest movements. You can sort of like back the genuine grievances of the protesters, but sort of be skeptical about the foreign meddling and like real foreign meddling here that we can see with this, with the NED and with most recently this American Agency for Global Media.
Right. Well, that also kind of, especially mentioning Syria there, turned on a little light. And I was thinking, there's a couple times in history where the U.S. has armed these protest movements and have resulted in killing Russians, including, previously with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But more recently, you had examples from 2015 of the Islamic State using a U.S.-made TOW anti-tank missile. We could ask John Brennan, I suppose, how that ended up there, but ISIS used one of those missiles to shoot down a Russian military helicopter. And so, this is an example of U.S. funding going to kill Russian soldiers, but you don't see Moscow sanctioning the U.S. over that.
That's right, yeah.
So, crazy stuff going on, and it's I guess especially been that the past many months. 2020 has been the year of hypocrisy from Washington, where everybody's trying to be a bigger hawk, and they're busy tweeting about the oppression in Venezuela and Hong Kong when we have drones flying over U.S. cities. They had an unarmed but a Predator drone flying over Minneapolis during the protest. You have U.S. cops walking down the streets giving orders to light people up for sitting on their porches. Like, if we're worried about oppression, we need to stop looking at overseas to figure this out. Look at our own police forces and our armed, federal police agencies and what they're doing to us at this point.
Yeah, and it's just ridiculous, too, if you look at the hypocrisy. I mean, you also have, there's so much to go over with Hong Kong. You also have, the last year that the lawmakers passed this law, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, where the State Department is now supposed to like judge the autonomy of Hong Kong. And that's supposed to be like, on that basis, we're going to either impose sanctions on China or, change our relationship, because we have sort of a special relationship with Hong Kong. We treat them differently than we treat the mainland. And it's just incredible. Like, I don't know, just imagine seeing a similar thing coming out of China. Like, you would not usually see China like taking it upon itself to rate the autonomy of the United States. Although certainly they could, I think, arguably do that right now. They could be fighting back with some of the same kind of dirty tricks if they wanted to with the George Floyd protests and stuff. But I don't think they have actually, done that.
Right. Well, Will, another great show this week. Thanks so much for coming back on. Remind people where they could find your work.
Sure. And Kyle, thank you for having me back on again. I always like coming on the show. If people want to find what I write, they are probably best off to go to my Twitter handle at WKP-ANCAP, ANCAP. You can find all the news and stuff I'm writing at RT there as a staff writer. You can find archives of mine also at antiwar.com, Consortium News, The Daily Sheeple, and the Libertarian Institute.
All right. Thanks for coming back on. Make sure to check out the Libertarian Institute for this show and my daily news roundup.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Will.